What do you do when you find out your wife is cheating? Do you fly into a rage? Plot your revenge? Or do you retreat into your shell and shut out the world? It's a complex cocktail of emotions, a raw whirlwind of anger, sadness, and confusion. The key to keeping your sanity lies in balancing those emotions, but honestly, I don't think anyone truly knows what that balance is. I certainly didn't when the first hints of infidelity began creeping into my mind, casting a long shadow over my marriage. Christine, my wife of 10 years, had always been the perfect partner, or so I thought. Little things began to nag at me, small inconsistencies that, when added up, painted a troubling picture. It started innocently enough. She would come home late from work, often claiming she was out with her friends, Samantha and Linda. I brushed it off at first, trusting her completely. But as time went on, those innocent explanations began to feel less genuine. The tipping point came one evening when Christine was late again. I had anticipated her arrival around 9 p.m., but when 10:30 rolled around, my heart sank. I asked her where she had been, and she replied nonchalantly that she was out with Samantha and Linda. But something was off. Just an hour earlier, I had received a call from Linda, who needed my help troubleshooting a problem on her computer. That phone call lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Christine was lying to me. I had always been faithful to Christine. I appreciated the beauty of other women, of course, but I had never crossed the line. Christine was 4 years younger than me, 33 years old, with a stunning complexion and a knack for fashion that turned heads wherever she went. She was the quintessential wife, a good cook, a meticulous homemaker, and adventurous in the bedroom. But as I stood there, the weight of betrayal settled on my chest like a heavy stone. She had morphed into the ugliest woman in Northampton, and I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me. That night, I went to bed almost immediately. I didn't want a confrontation. I was too filled with rage and confusion. When Christine eventually joined me, I pretended to be asleep, but my mind was anything but at rest. I tossed and turned, contemplating my next steps. It was a blessing in disguise that she was a heavy sleeper. Eventually, I drifted off, but the plan began to form in my mind. I needed proof, concrete evidence that would shatter the illusion of our perfect life. The next morning, I woke up early and headed straight to my home office. I had a singular focus: find a tracking device. After hours of searching the internet, I stumbled upon a GPS tracker that promised to log journeys and times, allowing me to download the data onto mapping software like AutoRoute or Maptitude. My heart raced as I placed the order and arranged for it to be delivered to my friend Ross's house. Ross had been through a similar situation. He knew my suspicions about Christine and offered me advice based on his own painful experience. I was grateful to have someone like him in my corner. 2 days later, Ross called to let me know my package had arrived. I was filled with a mix of excitement and dread as I drove over to collect it. My mind was racing with thoughts of how I would fit the tracker to Christine's car without her noticing. Then, serendipity struck. That evening, Christine returned home and casually asked me if I could take her car to the garage the next morning for a minor fix. She mentioned she'd be home late because she had a meeting in London. I couldn't believe my luck. This was the perfect opportunity to install the tracker. The following morning, I wasted no time. After dropping her off, I installed the GPS tracker under the rear parcel shelf of her car. She never went into the trunk since it was packed with my tools, making it the ideal hiding spot. I took her car for a quick drive around the block to ensure everything was working perfectly. When I returned, I hooked the unit up to my laptop, and to my relief, my 10-minute drive appeared highlighted on the AutoRoute map. I felt a mixture of triumph and anxiety as I realized I was one step closer to uncovering the truth. The plan was now in motion. Every day that followed, I watched the logs on my laptop with bated breath, waiting to see where she would go. Would she meet her lover? Was she even seeing someone? The unknown gnawed at me, but I had to remain patient. I had transformed from a devoted husband into a clandestine investigator in my own life, and the stakes had never been higher. Then came the day that would change everything. The tracker showed that Christine was spending a suspicious amount of time in a part of town I didn't recognize. I decided to follow her, my heart pounding in my chest. The thrill of the chase felt like a double-edged sword, exhilarating yet terrifying. As I drove through unfamiliar streets, I felt like a stranger in my own life. I finally caught up with her at a local cafe. I parked a safe distance away and watched as she laughed with a man I didn't recognize. He was handsome, with an air of confidence that radiated from him. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. The way she leaned in, her laughter ringing out like a siren, made it painfully clear that this was no ordinary friendship. My worst fears were confirmed, and the weight of betrayal hit me harder than I ever imagined. With each passing moment, my blood boiled, and I could feel my fists clenching involuntarily. The image of the woman I once adored was morphing into a stranger who had shattered my trust. I fought the urge to storm in there, to confront her and the man who had taken her from me. But I needed to think clearly. I needed to gather more evidence. I decided to follow them as they left the cafe, my heart racing as they walked hand in hand toward his car. I captured every moment on my phone, documenting the betrayal that unfolded before my eyes. It was a painful but necessary step in my journey for the truth. After a long and torturous day, I returned home, my heart heavy with the burden of what I had witnessed. I had the evidence I needed, but what would I do with it? As I sat in the dim light of the living room, clutching a glass of whiskey, I felt a mix of sadness and resolve. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment that would define not just our marriage but my life moving forward. I knew I had to confront Christine. The time for secrets was over. I would no longer be the passive husband in a failing marriage. I had gathered my evidence, and it was time to face her with the truth, whatever that truth might be. As the darkness closed in around me, I felt a surge of determination. I was ready to reclaim my life, and I was done being a victim of betrayal. The confrontation would come soon, and I would be prepared for whatever fallout followed. She walked through the door late, a little too late for my liking, clearly having spent the evening with Sam and Linda again. I felt a mix of frustration and resignation wash over me. It was too late to confront her without raising suspicions. So, I went to bed, trying to push the thoughts aside and ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. After a few minutes, she followed me into the shower and then crawled into bed beside me. To my surprise, she initiated sex, which was a stark contrast to the past few months when I had to make the first move. I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. I wasn't really in the mood, and I could tell that my lack of enthusiasm showed. But despite my reservations, she continued, and before long, I found myself caught up in the moment. Tired from the emotional roller coaster of the night, I quickly fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I headed straight for the tracker I had secretly installed on her car. After plugging it into my laptop, I watched her drive to work, but then something strange happened. After her shift, she didn't go home. Instead, she drove to a cul-de-sac on the other side of town called Preston Gardens. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, watching her park in front of one of the 6 large detached houses that lined the street. Each home sat on sprawling grounds, shrouded by trees that offered privacy from the outside world. It was the kind of neighborhood where the properties alone would fetch a hefty sum. I knew I needed a solid excuse to scope out the area and its occupants. An idea struck me, reviving a business concept I had considered about a year ago. I could offer a complete home maintenance service tailored for well-off homeowners. It was a long shot, but it was the perfect cover. I printed out 8 glossy brochures and decided to hit the pavement, cold calling as I went. Once I arrived in the cul-de-sac, I parked at the entrance and surveyed the scene. My initial impressions were spot on. Every house was accompanied by 2 or 3 expensive cars, and my modest Ford Focus felt painfully out of place. I approached the first house, where an elderly retired couple welcomed me with open arms. They were genuinely interested in my services, and we chatted for about 20 minutes. I felt like I could have closed the deal right then and there, but I wanted to leave the door open for a follow-up visit. So, I left my contact information and moved on to the next house. The next occupants were a couple in their early 40s. The husband worked from home, much like I did, and they had 3 teenagers lounging around. They weren't interested in my services. The husband seemed quite capable of handling any major DIY projects himself. I couldn't help but think about how strange it would be for him to entertain my wife right under the noses of their kids, even if his wife was away. The third house was empty, which left some possibilities open. The fourth house was occupied by an attractive young woman in her mid-20s. I couldn't deny that I wouldn't mind spending some time with her. With her husband out of town, it seemed like a perfect opportunity. However, I quickly dismissed the thought, reminding myself that I didn't want to add more complications to my already tangled life. The fifth house was vacant and up for sale, while the last one was home to a Japanese family. The husband worked at a new development in town, and they seemed like a nice family. After dismissing all but the empty house, a thought struck me: what if Jessica had been using the empty house for her rendezvous? Determined to find out, I headed home to change into a suit and called the real estate agent for an appointment. They informed me that all viewings had to be accompanied, which meant if I was on the right track, my chances were slim unless I managed to find someone who worked for the agency. I made my way to their office in town and feigned having arrived by train from London. This way, my car wouldn't be seen. I spent about 10 minutes in the office, scanning the faces of everyone around me, but no one seemed to fit the bill. My frustration mounted as I considered the possibility that Jessica might be slipping away from me, creating an entire life I wasn't a part of. The stakes were getting higher, and I felt the pressure mounting with every passing moment. Little did I know, the answers I sought were closer than I thought, and unraveling this tangled web would take me places I never imagined. I had already made up my mind about what I was looking for: a man between the ages of 30 and 60. The manager of the property and her assistant were both women, which only added to my confusion. Had Christine turned bisexual on me? The house viewing left me with more questions than answers. The place was empty, devoid of any signs that anyone had recently been there, and the electricity was off, meaning it would have been dark last night. I felt like I was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. When I got home, I plopped down in my office and started browsing on my computer, trying to connect the dots. I knew the answer lay somewhere in Preston Gardens, but it was just out of reach. I racked my brain, searching for any legitimate reason why Christine would have spent her evening there, but nothing came to mind. Then, just as I was about to give up, an email popped up on my screen. It simply read, "Getting warm in Preston Gardens." It had to be related to my search, but who had my email address? That's when it hit me: I had listed it on the brochures for the properties I was viewing. Someone from there must know something. Fueled by curiosity, I decided to head back and see the elderly couple who owned the house. Maybe they would unwittingly reveal something important. As I pulled up outside their house, my phone beeped with a text that read, "Getting colder." I immediately tried to call the number that had sent the message, but no one answered. I stepped out of the car, my mind racing, and decided to take a quick walk around the area to see if anything struck me. Someone was clearly watching me, playing this strange game of hotter or colder. As I strolled up the street, I received another text, "Getting warmer." Intrigued, I continued walking, and as I approached the house occupied by a woman in her 20s whose husband was away, another text came through, "Getting hot." Just as I reached the gates, the front door swung open, and the woman called me in. Little did I know, this was about to become one of the darkest hours of my life. I had suspected for a while that Christine was cheating, but this meeting was about to confirm my worst fears. As I walked up the driveway, the woman extended her hand and introduced herself as Amanda. "We need to talk," she said, her tone serious. Without wasting any time, she got straight to the point, My wife was having an affair with her husband, and it had been going on for months. I felt my stomach drop as waves of pain and anger washed over me. How could she start an affair like this? It was a horrible betrayal. Amanda explained that she had grown suspicious about 6 weeks ago and eventually hired a private investigator to follow her husband. She had just returned from a visit to her mother in France when the investigator called her with the news, complete with photographs, times, and locations of the rendezvous. She pulled out a file and showed me the evidence. There was my wife, looking every bit the part of the unfaithful spouse, along with her name and our address. The calls I had made in the cul-de-sac must have confirmed to Amanda that I was onto Christine, otherwise, it would have been an uncanny coincidence. I've been tracking her movements too, I confessed, detailing how I had planted a tracking device on Christine's car and what it had uncovered. Amanda looked at me, eyes filled with a mix of empathy and vindication, and asked what I planned to do. "I'm going to throw her out," I replied firmly. Amanda then began to tell me about her husband. His father owned a shoe factory and had investments in several other businesses, making him a junior partner in a web of enterprises. Amanda was furious and wanted revenge, revealing that this wasn't the first time her husband had cheated and she doubted it would be the last. As we shared our stories, she asked about my circumstances. I explained that we were mortgage-free, fairly well off, and enjoyed 2 incomes without any kids to worry about. "You've got a good setup," she said, her voice steady. "But it doesn't mean much when trust is broken." The reality of our situations hung heavily in the air, an unspoken bond forming between us as we sat there, both grappling with betrayal. This wasn't just a chance meeting, it was the start of a new chapter, one fueled by the shared pain of infidelity. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the living room window, I knew that my life was about to change forever, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for the storm that was coming. She asked me if I was willing to share half of my assets with my soon-to-be ex-wife, and, needless to say, my answer was a resounding no. Amanda had a plan to orchestrate a dramatic confrontation at the factory where her husband was the managing director. My wife, Christine, worked in the accounts department, and there was also Amanda's stepsister, who had been sidelined in the business and was clearly upset. This made her a potential ally in our mission. What baffled me was why Amanda's husband would cheat on her. She was every guy's dream, smart, funny, and gorgeous. As Amanda headed to the kitchen to brew a pot of tea, I couldn't help but feel a sense of camaraderie developing between us. Over tea, we discussed strategies to protect my assets and she provided me with the name of a friendly solicitor, someone she trusted. She thought it would take about 2 to 3 weeks to get everything sorted out. I asked her if the affair was likely to die down, but she shook her head. "No, they're getting together at least twice a week," she replied, frustration evident in her voice. After laying out our plans, we parted ways as comrades in arms, even if we weren't quite friends yet. Despite Amanda's attractiveness, I didn't mourn her as a person, perhaps it was just the context of our meeting. Yes, I was devastated, but having a plan and someone to strategize with helped me face the storm ahead. Deep down, I'd known for some time that Christine was cheating, so it wasn't a total shock. When I got home, I knew the cheater would be back in about an hour. The next couple of days passed without incident, and then Christine announced she would be late the following night because she was going out with Sam and Linda. My heart sank, but I kept my composure and sent a quick text to Amanda. "They're meeting tomorrow night." Her response was swift, "I know. He just told me he'll be away tomorrow night. Want to have a little fun? Pick me up at 4 p.m. I wasn't quite sure what she meant by fun, but I was intrigued enough to go along with it. When I picked her up, Amanda explained that we were heading to the Travelodge Hotel, where they usually met. He's supposed to be in London, so they should arrive around 6 p.m. That gives us some time. I felt a mixture of nerves and excitement as we drove. At the hotel, Amanda had a brief whispered conversation with the receptionist and handed over a £50 note in exchange for a key card to her room. Once inside, She pulled a small packet from her handbag. "Itching powder," she said with a sly smile. "This will give them something to think about." She set a small camera behind the curtain, promising to recover it in the morning. We headed back to reception, where Amanda chatted with the receptionist again. "Could you make sure no one else goes into that room after the guests leave?" she asked, slipping another £50 to the girl. The receptionist nodded, clearly on our side. When I got home, I tried to act nonchalant, waiting up for Christine. She finally arrived around 10:45 p.m., claiming she was late because she had to drop her friend off. I noticed she was fidgeting, and it was obvious that the itching powder was doing its job. After she took a long shower, Christine climbed into bed, and I pretended to fall asleep. My phone buzzed with a call from Amanda the next morning. "I got the camera back, and it made for some interesting viewing," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Can't wait to see it," I replied, my heart racing at the thought of what was on that tape. I had a feeling that the pieces of my life were about to shift dramatically, and I was ready for the confrontation that awaited me. After the positive response I received from the older couple in Preston Gardens about the home maintenance package, I decided it was time to pursue that idea more seriously. It had been lingering in my mind for over a year, and my recent visit to Preston Gardens made me dust it off again. That evening, I saw an opportunity to play some mind games with Christine. We were headed to visit her parents, who lived just outside Northampton, and I casually mentioned that I needed to drop off a brochure on the way. "I'll only be 5 minutes," I assured her, secretly planning to check in on the old couple again and hopefully close the sale. As I pulled into Preston Gardens, I noticed Christine tense up beside me. However, when I stopped short of Amanda and James's house, she relaxed slightly. I knocked on the door, was invited in, and in just 5 minutes, I successfully closed the deal. I left the house and rejoined Christine in the car. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to gauge her mood. She replied with a strained yes, but I could tell her nerves were still frayed. She didn't seem to calm down until we were well away from Preston Gardens. On our way to her parents' house, my phone buzzed. It was the old couple calling to ask if I wanted to pick up the signed agreements on my way back. Of course, I did. I had the phone on speaker, and as soon as I hung up, Christine exploded. "I have to be up early. My boss needs me to prepare some reports before he leaves town." Her boss, of course, was James, Amanda's husband. I paused, thinking it over. "Okay, we can leave a bit earlier. I'll drop you off at home so you can get a good night's sleep," I suggested. This only seemed to irritate her further. By the time we arrived at her parents' house, she was in a foul mood and ended up picking a fight with her dad. What started as a minor disagreement quickly escalated into a full-blown row, and her mom, Joan, and I retreated into the conservatory to escape the shouting. Once we were out of earshot, Joan turned to me, concern etched on her face. "What's going on with Christine? Did you two have a fight?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "It must be that time of the month." Joan caught me off guard with her next words. "She's been having that time every week lately. I think there's something wrong. Is there anything you want to tell me?" "No," I replied, but I could see that Joan wasn't buying it. She had a knack for reading between the lines and knew something was up. The issue was that I knew her well enough to realize she wouldn't stop digging until she got to the bottom of it. And if she discovered the truth, that her daughter was having an affair, she wouldn't take it lightly. As we prepared to leave, Joan subtly slipped a piece of paper into my pocket. We drove back toward Northampton in silence, the tension in the car palpable. When we finally got home, Christine said she was off to bed. I told her I had a few things to sort out and that I would sleep in the spare room so I wouldn't disturb her. I took a moment to sort through the paperwork for the property maintenance contract with the old couple. After finishing, I pulled out Joan's note and read it. "Ring me during the day, please. I want to talk." The next morning, Christine left early, just after 7 a.m. She would be at the office by 7:30 at the latest. I couldn't help but wonder what she was up to. When I got in around 5 o'clock, I found Christine in the kitchen, cooking. She seemed a lot happier than she had been the night before. "Why are you home early?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I wanted to make a nice meal to make it up to you," she replied, a bright smile lighting up her face. The following evening, Thursday, I arrived at Amanda's house at 6:30. We discussed our plans for the next day, when Vanessa, James's half-sister, would get Christine and James settled in the upstairs conference room at 10 a.m. Amanda and I would arrive right after, as the receptionist had been informed to expect us and would send us straight up. Little did Christine know, the show was just about to begin. I had the divorce papers ready for Christine, and Amanda had hers for James. Along with those, she also had copies of all the incriminating photos I had managed to gather over the past few weeks. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that our marriages had crumbled, but there was no turning back now. I got home around 9:30 that night, and by the time Christine walked in an hour later, I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. But inside, my mind was racing, replaying the events that had led to this moment. The next morning was a blur of anxiety and anticipation as Christine left for work at her usual time. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I met Amanda outside the shoe factory at 10 minutes to 10, my heart pounding in my chest. Vanessa, James's young assistant, joined us at reception. She was in her mid-20s, not the kind of girl who turned heads, but there was something about her that I found oddly attractive. We made our way to the conference room, where Christine and James were already seated at the table with a few papers in front of them. Christine had her back to the door and was blissfully unaware of our presence until Amanda and I walked in. James noticed us first and called out to Amanda. The moment Christine turned around and saw me, her face paled. I handed her the envelope containing the divorce papers, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling with shock. "Can't we talk about this?" Amanda, unwavering, replied, "You've been having an affair with my husband for months." "Good for you." Her voice dripped with sarcasm, and I felt a surge of pride in her strength. I jumped in, unable to hold back my disdain. "James, you're scum in my eyes. I thought about arranging a beating for you, but I'll leave that to karma." I glared at him, the tension in the room thickening. Christine looked utterly bewildered as Amanda passed James a paper. His response was cold, "Hard luck. You signed a prenuptial agreement." At that moment, James's father entered the room, his face a mask of confusion. "What the heck is going on here?" he asked, scanning the room. After a brief silence, Vanessa stepped forward, her voice steady. "It seems James has been having an affair with my wife, and Amanda and I are in the process of confronting them." I turned my attention back to Christine. "You're going to leave the house. I'm having the locks changed as we speak. You can fight me for a settlement, but I have evidence that I'll be sharing with your family, your mom, dad, and sisters." The finality of my words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. "Or you can take a specific amount of money and get out of my life for good." James's father looked at his son, disappointment etched across his face. "Amanda is intelligent and a good wife, and you had to ruin it with someone else's wife." His voice was heavy with disdain. James sat there, pushing a piece of paper toward his father, who blanched at the sight of it. Vanessa turned to us and asked us to leave. We had done what we came for, and as we walked out of the factory, I could hear the chaos erupting behind us, Christine and James shouting, blaming each other for their mistakes. As we exited, Vanessa turned to Amanda and me, her voice cutting through the tension. "Maybe now Dad will realize my brother is a waste of space and take me seriously." We left together in silence, exchanging only a brief nod. Neither of us wanted to draw attention, knowing the rumors would start flying as soon as we left. Once home, I let myself in, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I sat down and cried, feeling utterly heartbroken by Christine's behavior. I had loved her deeply, and I think it finally hit me that this was the end of everything we had built together. I sat in the chair with the TV on, but I wasn't really watching. My mind was lost in a world of pain and disbelief. My phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Joan, Christine's friend. I let it ring for a while, but the relentless sound pierced through my fog, and I eventually picked up. Joan launched straight into a long-winded speech about how Christine had called her in a panic, claiming she had a fling but that it didn't mean anything. I stopped her mid-sentence. "Joan, Christine has been having an affair behind my back for at least 3 months, maybe longer." The words tasted bitter, but there was also a sense of relief in finally saying them out loud. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in Joan's mind as she processed what I had just said. I knew this would change everything. The web of lies was beginning to unravel, and soon the truth would be laid bare for everyone to see. But for now, all I could do was navigate the storm of emotions swirling inside me, wondering what the future held as I prepared to step into a new chapter of my life, one without Christine. Christine had been seeing her boss, the partner in her betrayal, at least twice a week. I suspected they were also sneaking around during work hours. When I finally confronted her, I made it clear, I was filing for divorce. "If you try to squeeze more than a minimal settlement out of me," I warned, "I'll make your life a living hell. Everyone will know what kind of person you really are, and I have the pictures to prove it." The gravity of my words hit her hard. Joan, her friend and accomplice in deceit, had started crying, her voice choked with emotion. "I thought you were the one having the affair," she said between sobs, the irony not lost on me. But as the tears flowed, she managed to pull herself together. "I'm sorry, Tony. We really like you, and you've been a good husband. I think Christine made a huge mistake." I agreed with her sentiment but was too drained to engage any further. I decided I needed a distraction. Grabbing my old bike from the garage, I set out for a ride on the country roads. The sun was shining, and the air was fresh, a perfect afternoon for some solitude. I pedaled hard, letting the wind whip past me, trying to clear my mind. After at least 2 hours on the road, I returned home only to find Christine waiting for me on the doorstep. Her eyes were red and puffy, a clear sign she had been crying. As I rode up the driveway, she rushed towards me, desperation in her voice. "Tony, I'm so sorry. Can we talk?" I ignored her, choosing instead to put my bike away in the garage. "Please, I'm sorry." She called again, following me inside. "I don't love James. It was just a fling." Her words felt rehearsed, like the old clichés people use when their affairs are exposed. The way she said it only fueled my anger. "At least talk to me. You owe me that," she pleaded. I opened the front door, allowing her to stand on the step while I stepped back into the house. She clearly expected to follow, but I turned and blocked her path. "Listen," I said quietly, "I have a recording from the travel lodge where you and James declared your love for each other. So forgive me if I don't believe you when you say it was just a fling. I owe you nothing." Her face fell, and the facade cracked. "What do I have to do to convince you?" "I'm sorry," she cried, her desperation evident. I stared at her, my frustration boiling over. "I don't doubt that you're sorry, sorry you got caught, sorry James isn't playing along anymore. But my problem is trust. Even if I could somehow overlook your betrayal, how could I ever trust you again? Every time you're late coming home, I'll wonder if it's really just a traffic jam. Even if you want to go to a work event or meet colleagues after hours, I'll question your intentions. We can't live like that." Her sobs grew louder, echoing through the hallway. "I know it's a mess," she said between breaths. "The first thing I'll do is give you your divorce on your terms. I want to prove to you that I'm truly sorry, that I can be trusted. We can't do that if we're locked in a bitter fight in court." I regarded her, weighing my options. "Fine, I muttered, trying to suppress the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "Can I come in and collect some clothes?" she asked tentatively. I nodded but followed up on her comment. "You can take some clothes now, but find a lawyer tomorrow and accept my terms. Then we can talk about what else is yours and arrange to get it moved." Christine, regaining some composure, responded, "I've already talked to a solicitor. I told him to accept your terms, even though he advised me that I could get more. I explained why I'm accepting your offer, and I instructed him to proceed on my behalf." I opened the door wider, letting her in. She headed upstairs to our bedroom, her demeanor a mixture of relief and apprehension. As I stood in the doorway, I felt the weight of everything we had lost. Our life together had been shattered by her choices, and while a part of me wanted to believe she was sincere, another part was consumed by the scars of betrayal. As she rummaged through her clothes, I couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the end or merely the beginning of a new chapter filled with pain and uncertainty. Every decision we made from this point on would shape our lives forever. And in that moment, I realized that healing would take far more than just time. It would require trust, a fragile thing that felt almost impossible to rebuild. I had made up my mind to follow her, but then I thought better of it. I decided to see what she would bring down with her and waited in the living room. About 15 minutes later, she emerged, dragging a large suitcase behind her. I walked her to the door, and she casually mentioned that she would be staying at her mom and dad's for a while. I simply nodded, saying, "Okay." After she left, I picked up my phone and called my brother in British Columbia, waking him up at the crack of dawn, 6:30 a.m. there. I explained the mess I was dealing with, and after listening patiently, he offered a solution: why not come visit him in Canada for a couple of weeks? I jumped at the idea. I could let my lawyer handle things back home while I took a much-needed break. By 4:30 p.m., I had flights booked. I would be flying out on Monday and staying for 2 weeks, returning the following Tuesday evening. Later that night, Amanda called me. We compared notes about our respective situations, and as I expected, James was pulling out all the stops to prevent Amanda from filing for divorce on the grounds of adultery. "When are you coming over to see me?" she asked, sounding a bit anxious. I told her the truth: I'm actually going away for a couple of weeks. I think we both need some space to process everything. There was a brief silence before she responded. "Are we finished?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I took a deep breath. "I think you're beautiful, intelligent, and incredibly attractive. Any man who gets to love you would be the luckiest guy in the world. But with all the stress we've been under lately, I really think we need to think about the future apart for a bit." After a few seconds of silence, Amanda spoke again, this time more softly. "Tony, I know this is all happening so fast, but I'm falling in love with you. And yes, there's definitely some lust involved too." Her words took me off guard, leaving me momentarily speechless. When she asked if I was still there, I snapped back to reality. "Yes," I replied, "I'll be flying back into HRO from Vancouver on Tuesday. If you still feel the same way when I return, maybe we can meet at the airport." She brightened a bit at the prospect and promised she'd be there. But then she asked, "What do I get in return?" I chuckled, surprised by her boldness. "What do you want?" I asked, intrigued. Her answer came quickly: "I want to see if we can make this work as a couple. Whether we start dating or even consider moving in together." I wasn't sure about moving in together just yet, but I couldn't deny my attraction to Amanda. Part of me wondered if she was out of my league, and suddenly, the thought of waiting 2 weeks felt like an eternity. Over the weekend, I packed and prepared for my trip to visit Neil. I called Joan to let her know I would be gone for 2 weeks and asked if Christine needed anything while I was away. Joan and Christine came over about half an hour later. Christine was unusually quiet. As they were leaving, she turned to me and said, "When you get back, think about what I would need to do to win you back." I didn't want to get into another discussion about our relationship, especially in front of Joan. I need these 2 weeks to get my head together, I said firmly. Now is not the time. She nodded, but her eyes held a mixture of sadness and determination. Okay, I can wait, she replied. I flew out on Monday, and being with Neil, his wife Cindy, and their 3 kids helped take my mind off everything. They lived in a stunning house overlooking a wooded valley. We went on nature walks along the trails, and I even took Neil's oldest son mountain biking on some local trails. It felt good to disconnect, at least for a little while. By the end of the first week, I called my lawyer to check in. He informed me that Christine's attorney had confirmed that the terms we'd discussed were acceptable and that the necessary documents were being prepared. The 2 weeks flew by much faster than I had anticipated. On Monday evening, I found myself on the flight back to HRO, filled with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Would Amanda be there to greet me? I still wasn't entirely sure what her motives were, and as the plane touched down, I felt a flutter of uncertainty in my stomach. Jet-lagged and tired, I stepped off the plane and scanned the crowd, wondering what the next chapter of my life would hold. As I made my way to the baggage claim and navigated through customs and immigration, a mix of anticipation and anxiety swirled within me. When I stepped past the immigration desk, I spotted Amanda standing at the barrier, waving enthusiastically. Relief washed over me at the sight of her. It felt good to know she was there for me, especially after everything that had transpired. We arrived back at my house around 11 p.m., and to my surprise, she stayed the night. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed after a peaceful sleep. Amanda was already in the kitchen, preparing tea and toast. As I settled back against the pillows, I couldn't help but smile at the comfort of her presence. "Morning," I said, my voice still hoarse with sleep. "Morning. I made your favorite," she replied, serving me a plate with a flourish. We sat together in bed, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. Curious about her situation, I asked, "So, how's James handling your demands?" Amanda took a deep breath. "His solicitors are advising him to settle, and he's offered me a lump sum payment. The house in Preston Gardens is included in the deal." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you think about it?" She shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like a lot of money to me. A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush, right?" Over the next few weeks, our lives became a blur of moving between my house and Amanda's. I won't lie, it was challenging. The essentials always seemed to be at the other place, which made the adjustment feel awkward. Meanwhile, both of our divorces were progressing. Amanda had decided to accept James's offer, while I had received confirmation that Christine was ready to accept mine. I started exploring the option of raising a small mortgage on my house to pay Christine off, not wanting to drain my savings completely. Amanda began to drop hints about me moving in with her permanently. One Friday, I returned home to find her showing me one of the spare rooms, which she had converted into an office. "See? There's no excuse now. You can move your stuff in this weekend," she said with a hopeful smile. I hired a van the following Saturday morning, and by tea time, I had most of my belongings transferred to her place. On Monday, I visited the estate agent to set the wheels in motion to rent out my house. I was pleasantly surprised to learn that there was a shortage of family-sized homes in the area, which meant I could expect a decent rental income. As a couple of weeks passed, I couldn't deny that the intimacy with Amanda was electric, but I also began to feel a bit smothered. It seemed like all she did was wait for me to come home from work. Christine, meanwhile, had tried to reach out a few times. She was now aware of my relationship with Amanda, and Amanda answered each call, claiming that I wouldn't speak to her, a blatant lie. One morning, while sitting through a tedious meeting with a client, a thought struck me. Amanda hadn't had her period since I returned from Canada 5 weeks ago. Was she pregnant? Or was there some other issue? She hadn't mentioned anything, but I resolved to ask her about it later. When I got home around 5 p.m., Amanda had prepared a lovely meal, as usual. We sat down to eat, and I casually asked, "How are you feeling?" "Fine," she replied, but I could sense a shift in the air. Deciding to tackle the subject head-on, I said, "It's just. There hasn't been any sign of your monthly cycle, and it's been over 5 weeks since I got back from Canada." For once, she fell silent, her eyes drifting down to her plate. I waited patiently, and after what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke up, "I'm late. I think I might be pregnant." The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I stared at her, momentarily speechless. "Say something," she urged, her eyes searching mine. A nervous laugh escaped my lips. "Well, I suppose we have been going at it like rabbits. But aren't you on the pill?" She shook her head. "No, I have implants." I had little knowledge about contraceptive implants, but I knew a trip to her gynecologist was in order. "Maybe you should see your gynecologist or get a pregnancy test," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady as my mind raced with the implications of her words. This was uncharted territory for both of us, and I could feel the gravity of the moment weighing heavily on my shoulders. As we finished dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives were about to change in ways we couldn't yet comprehend. The atmosphere in the room felt thick with tension as I looked over at Christine, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands nervously fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "Are you worried about being pregnant?" I asked, hoping to ease the weight hanging between us. She shrugged, insisting it didn't bother her, but I could see the anxiety etched on her face. To calm her down, I took a deep breath and said, "I still love you, even if you're pregnant." It was a bold statement for me. We'd always been caught up in a whirlwind of passion, dancing around the word love. But in that moment, I wanted her to know I was there for her, no matter what. That night in bed, our intimacy felt more charged than usual. As we made love, I began to think maybe this pregnancy could bring us closer together, perhaps even solidify what we had. The next morning, I had a meeting in London, but Christine promised me she would go see the doctor. I was hopeful that everything would turn out fine. During my lunch break, I called her, and her voice was bubbly with excitement. "Guess what? I'm pregnant," she exclaimed. "The implants failed for some reason, and the doctor removed them." I didn't ask how far along she was. I assumed about 4 weeks. Over the next few days, she seemed to relax, and I even managed to convince her to go out for dinner with me on Friday night. For the first time in a while, things felt normal, even as Christine had given up trying to contact me. However, Saturday morning changed everything. We went shopping as we usually did, and everything was going smoothly until we reached the checkout. Suddenly, she went pale and collapsed right there on the floor. Panic surged through me as the store's help desk called for an ambulance. She came to a few minutes later, but even though she insisted she was fine, I felt uneasy. I insisted we go to the hospital to get her checked out. Once there, a nurse took a blood sample and returned shortly with a smile and a Mars bar. "You're fine, but your blood sugar is very low," she said. "Eat this and take it easy for a few hours. This often happens around the 12th week of pregnancy." As I looked at Christine, I noticed a subtle swell in her belly, and the realization hit me like a freight train. 12 weeks, that meant she was already pregnant before we even met. My heart sank, and before I knew it, tears streamed down her face. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer. I left the hospital in a daze and called a cab. I was done with lying, cheating women, and my common sense kicked in. I directed the taxi to the agency handling the rental of my house. Fortunately, I managed to withdraw it from the market, even though a couple was ready to sign a 6-month lease the following week. I promised the agents I would cover their out-of-pocket expenses and compensate them for their trouble, which they agreed was reasonable. By lunchtime, I was back in my old house, feeling utterly sorry for myself. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls from Amanda. She must have rung 30 times in just a couple of hours, sending so many texts that they filled the memory of my phone. I didn't even bother reading them. In the end, I decided that the answer to my problems lay at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. I poured myself a generous glass and drank until my troubles began to fade away. By 3 p.m., I was passed out in my chair, oblivious to the world around me. I must have dozed off for 2 or 3 hours because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by loud banging on the front door. Groggy and disoriented, I got up to see Vanessa, James's half-sister, pounding on the window and beckoning me to let her in. I stumbled to the door and opened it. She walked in, her expression serious. "Okay, I want your side of the story," she said, crossing her arms. "Amanda is at my house claiming you abandoned her at the hospital." I rubbed my temples, trying to piece together my thoughts. This was about to get a lot messier than I had anticipated. She was nearly in hysterics when I answered the phone, her voice trembling with emotion. But amidst her panic, she dropped a bombshell: she was pregnant. I took a deep breath and began my story, starting with the day I noticed Amanda hadn't had her period for 5 weeks. I concluded by sharing the chilling revelation I had received at the hospital, where a nurse had glanced at her notes and confirmed she was 12 weeks along. I made it clear that I was in the process of divorcing one lying, cheating woman and had zero intention of getting tangled up with another. After I finished, there was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Vanessa finally broke it, saying she would go have another conversation with Amanda. "She hasn't actually lied to her," Vanessa said, "but she's definitely left out some critical details." With that, she got up to leave, promising to return later. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was dark outside, and I heard someone knocking at the door. I opened it to find Vanessa standing there, balancing 2 pizza boxes and a bottle of soda. "Hey. I thought you might need some dinner," she said, bustling in as I turned on the light. After she settled the food on the table, she said she had just spoken with Amanda. "It appears she hasn't used any contraceptives since the two of you got together." She also admitted to having a brief fling in France while visiting her mother. "Great," I replied, frustration boiling over. "It won't do her any good coming crawling back here. She has her house, and I'm hiring movers to bring my things back here as soon as possible. I can't handle another lying woman." Vanessa frowned but nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. After finishing our discussion, she left, and I found myself sitting alone for about half an hour, staring blankly into space. Deep down, I had always felt that my relationship with Amanda was a bit strange. Sure, the sex had been good, but emotionally, she felt distant, and now I finally understood why. Just then, my phone rang again. I remembered that I had set Amanda's number to go straight to voicemail, so I picked it up. To my surprise, it was my brother Tony calling from Canada. We usually spoke every other Saturday, taking turns to catch up. "Hey, Tony. How's it going?" I forced a cheerful tone into my voice, but he quickly picked up on my mood. "Not so good, huh?" he replied, concern creeping into his voice. I sighed, feeling 100 little men hammering inside my head. "Yeah, it's been a rough couple of days," I admitted, and then I let it all spill out, the drama with Amanda, the pregnancy, and the realization that my life had turned upside down. "Man, you really are out of luck with women at the moment," he said sympathetically after I finished my tale. We chatted for a bit longer, and he casually mentioned that I could come visit him in Canada whenever I wanted. I chuckled, saying, if I went to Canada every time a relationship broke down, I might as well just emigrate. He laughed but then turned serious. "Well, there are some great jobs in the mines out here. I know you wouldn't mind the work, and it's not like Christine was ever keen on moving to the country." His words lingered in my mind as we ended our conversation. I crawled into bed that night feeling drained and hungover, not from alcohol, but from the emotional whirlwind that had taken over my life. Sunday morning came, and my phone buzzed incessantly. Amanda had called multiple times and sent me at least a dozen frantic texts. I deleted them without reading but realized I had to speak to her, if for no other reason than to retrieve my things. Taking a deep breath, I decided to bite the bullet and dial her number. She answered on the first ring, her voice filled with a mix of relief and guilt. "I'm so sorry, I should have told you, but it's not like I cheated on you," she started, her words stumbling over each other. I knew better than to get into a heated argument. "Look, I'm moving out," I said flatly. "I don't think this will work. It's a trust issue, Amanda. You let me go on thinking that baby was mine. And I can only imagine how you'd spin it, claiming it was premature when you gave birth early." I could hear her voice cracking as she continued to plead her case. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I'm so sorry. I'm getting a man with a van to collect my things in the morning. I'm moving back to my house for now. Please, just hear me out," she begged. But there was nothing left to discuss. I hung up, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak wash over me. I was tired of the lies, tired of the games. Now, all I wanted was to reclaim my life and start anew, even if that meant stepping into the unknown. She was the problem, and as I sat in the small cafe nursing a cup of coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. 6 weeks ago, I had heard a similar story from another woman, and I wasn't in the mood to listen to Amanda's excuses. Instead, I ordered a full English breakfast, the sizzling bacon and eggs a temporary distraction from the chaos swirling in my mind. As I chewed on the hearty meal, I recalled Neil's words from the night before about working in the mines. If what he said was true, about the decent salaries and assistance with immigration, it might be worth considering. After all, I was feeling increasingly fed up with my life as it was. By the time I got home around 10 a.m., a sense of determination washed over me. I decided to take my bike out for a spin before digging into the opportunities my brother had mentioned. I pedaled furiously for about an hour, working out my frustrations with every push of the pedals. The fresh air cleared my mind, and when I returned, I sat down at my laptop to look up the mining companies. My brother's link showed promising offers, and I filled out an online application, not entirely sure if I would hear back but convinced it was worth a shot. The rest of the day slipped by as I pottered around the house, doing a bit of shopping and gradually getting used to the idea of being on my own. I hit the sack early and surprisingly slept well, but I woke up the next morning with the dawn. After making some tea and breakfast, I glanced at the clock. It was 8 a.m. With a sudden urge to take action, I flipped through the yellow pages for man with a van ads. Half an hour later, I had secured a removal man and called Amanda to let her know I'd be over at 10 o'clock to pick up my things. Her voice was apologetic as usual, filled with regret for lying to me. I cut her off, tired of the same old routine. "Change the record, Amanda. I'm sick of hearing it," I snapped, ending the call with a frustrated click. I warned the van man about the possibility of a scene, but he shrugged it off. "I've dealt with worse," he said, reassuring me that he would get my things and leave without a hitch. When we arrived at Amanda's place right on the dot, she came out to greet us, looking as stunning as ever. I had to admit, despite the lies, she was a fine-looking woman. Surprisingly, she kept her composure. No drama, no begging, just an offer of tea as we loaded my things into the van. One of the other removal guys turned to me and said, "I can't believe you are walking away from that. She's page 3 material." I recounted the lies, but he just chuckled. "Yeah, maybe, but she is one sexy woman." Once we had loaded the last of my belongings, Amanda approached me, her expression softening. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't hate me." With that, she pulled away, turning back towards the house, leaving me feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. By 2 p.m., all my things were back at my house. I sank into the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The temptation to reach for the whiskey bottle was strong, but the memory of Saturday's hangover was still fresh in my mind. I must have sat there for over an hour, lost in thought, reflecting on the past few months. I eventually decided that running off to see my brother for a holiday wouldn't solve anything. I would still have to face my issues when I returned. However, if I could secure a long-term contract in Canada, or even immigrate permanently, I would go for it. After all, I had nothing keeping me in the UK. My parents were gone, and my nearest relative was living in Canada. By 4 p.m., I finally broke free from my funk. I needed to do something to lift my spirits. After making a simple meal, I changed into something presentable and headed up to the pub where the cricket team usually gathered. The season may have ended, but I figured there would be a few mates hanging out. When I arrived around 8 p.m., I spotted two of the lads inside. We fell into easy conversation, laughing and reminiscing about old times. Despite the weight of everything I had just been through, I realized I was grateful for their company. That night, surrounded by friends, I began to feel a flicker of hope ignite within me, a sense that maybe, just maybe, brighter days were ahead. We spent the evening playing pool and darts, engaging in deep conversations that made us feel like we could solve all the world's problems. By the time I got behind the wheel, I was completely stone-cold sober. It was 11:30 when I finally arrived home. Without wasting a moment, I headed straight to bed, hoping for some rest. The next morning, I dove back into work, tackling 5 days' worth of tasks in just 4. The week passed by surprisingly quickly, and I adjusted to sleeping alone. However, I dreaded the impending weekend. Just as I was bracing myself for the loneliness, I received an email from a company requesting urgent electrical refurbishment work over the next few weekends. I gladly accepted. It was just the distraction I needed. As the following week rolled in, I was checking my emails when I stumbled across a reply to a job application I had submitted earlier. They thanked me for my interest and invited me for an interview in London in 3 weeks. Attached was a questionnaire asking whether the move would be permanent or temporary and if my partner would be joining me. I filled it out promptly and accepted their invitation, hopeful about the opportunity. Despite working 7 days a week, I found myself missing intimacy more than I expected. So, on Friday night, I decided to put myself out there and see if I could meet someone. I had considered trying online dating but wasn't sure it would work for me. Instead, I dressed up and hit the pubs around town. It was in the third bar that I met her, Chanel, a vibrant woman in her early 20s, with a larger-than-life personality. She latched onto me almost instantly, and I figured, why not? So, I indulged in my first one-night stand in over 12 years. The weeks that followed flew by. Chanel and I met up every Friday. However, I started to feel uneasy about her growing attachment. Despite being nearly half my age, she didn't seem to mind. She often complained about how immature guys her age were, dropping hints that she was looking for something more serious. The day of the interview finally arrived, and I made my way to London. The process was rigorous. I could tell that offers would only be made to the most qualified candidates. After lunch, I noticed several people leaving. Clearly, they hadn't made the cut. Fortunately, I wasn't sent home. At 4 o'clock, I was called back into the interview room. To my surprise, they offered me the position of chief electrical engineer, contingent on a few more hurdles, a security check, a medical exam, and more. They were even willing to fly me out for a week to visit the site before making a final decision. The choice was between a 2-year contract or a permanent position, complete with an immigration package. I accepted the offer for the visit and inquired whether I would need to return to the UK if I took the position, mentioning that my brother lived about 150 miles south. By the time I boarded the 7 o'clock train back home, I was riding high on the adrenaline of the day. Chanel called me while I was en route and insisted on meeting me at the station. When I arrived in Northampton, she was there on the platform, beaming as if I had been away for a month. She wrapped me in a warm hug, but her expression quickly shifted when I shared how the interview had gone. "What can I do to change your mind?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. I shook my head gently. "There's really nothing you can do," I replied, trying to soften the blow. That night, we had a bittersweet goodbye. In the midst of tears, we shared one last moment together, both of us feeling the weight of what was happening. It was a mixture of sorrow and longing, marking the end of something that never quite had the chance to begin. I had really taken a liking to her, and as my departure loomed closer, I found myself asking if she would consider joining me. But she hesitated, explaining that she had deep roots here, her parents, siblings, and friends were all part of her life. She couldn't just pick up and leave without a second thought. As the night before my departure approached, a sense of reality began to settle in. I realized I would have no one to drive me to the airport, so I booked a taxi. After setting my alarm, I crawled into bed, hoping this would be my last night in the UK for a long time. I switched off my phone, wanting to avoid the noise that came with my impending departure. Christine had caught wind of my plans and was trying to call me every day. Even James's lawyer had reached out, bombarding me with questions that I had no intention of answering. I brusquely told him to take a hike. "You know, I could issue a subpoena to force you to attend court and give evidence," he warned. "Sure, but I'll be 3,500 miles away by next week," I replied, ending the call without a second thought. It was clear that James was starting to piece things together, perhaps even suspecting what had happened. While Amanda had her fair share of lies, in my eyes, James was far worse. I had no intention of helping him in any way. I loathed lawyers, but for once, I found myself hoping that they would litigate James's fortune into oblivion. Amanda kept trying to reach me, and Chanel called twice over the weekend. Her calls hit me the hardest. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was caught in the crossfire of my need for change. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the sense of unease gnawing at me. The taxi was scheduled to arrive at 5 a.m. the next morning, and despite my best efforts, I fell into a restless sleep around midnight. My mind was racing, hardly surprising given the circumstances. When the alarm finally jolted me awake at 4 a.m., I felt disoriented but resolved. Everything was prepared, so I didn't worry about forgetting anything. Still, I double-checked my travel pouch with my passport and important documents at least 5 times before the taxi arrived. I dozed in the backseat during the ride to the airport, and by the time we reached Heathrow, I felt somewhat human again. I found the check-in desk and settled in for the long, tedious wait that accompanies any long-haul flight. Finally, the time came to board, and as I took my seat, I felt a rush of excitement. In about 7 hours, I would be on the other side of the Atlantic. When I arrived in Canada, I quickly settled in, feeling a sense of freedom wash over me. I was ready to start fresh. I kept in touch with Chanel for a while, but soon, my new life consumed my attention. My divorce from Christine progressed smoothly, and Amanda's situation was resolved as well. I had plans to get married again, but I was taking my time with that decision. Looking back, I had no regrets about my actions. I didn't just sit idly by and accept my circumstances, I took charge and made a change. I've learned to keep my guard up, knowing that life can change in an instant, and I'm hoping for the best as I navigate this new chapter.